My Life and Quest by Arthur Osborne Sri Ramanasram Tiruvannamalai 2001. Copyright Sri Ramanasram Tiruvannamalai First Edition, Year 201 2000 copies ISBN No. 8188225207 Price. Forward. Many years after my father's death in 1970, I opened an old suitcase and found several of his unpublished manuscripts. It is strange that they remained buried and unknown for so long, but perhaps now is the time for this story to be told. Reading through them, it was intriguing to see how true his voice was and how it endured over the years. One of these documents was his autobiography that he had entitled, The Mountain Path, My Quest. Later, when he founded the quarterly magazine for Ramanasram, he used the title, Mountain Path, for that, so he decided to leave it out of this work in order to avoid confusion. It is an apt title for the chronicle of his life, which was dedicated firstly, to finding the path, and once he was sure that he had found the right one, he was utterly committed to it. His poetry as much as his prose show what a struggle it was for him at times, how he fought with darkness and despair, but, as he points out, a man who is climbing Mount Everest does not stop to play the violin. Through all his vicissitudes, his faith in Bhagavan was unwavering, and Bhagavan recognized in him his humility and dedication. Sometimes when he was sitting in the hall with his eyes closed in meditation, Bhagavan would look at him with such love that it could move one to tears. Even as a child, I recognized this as something very special. He was a very special person and father, but as he was the only one I had ever known, I perhaps did not quite realize his uniqueness until much later. Of course, some things were outstanding even to me. He writes about being quite gregarious as a young man. Be that as it may, by the time he was an older man, and my father, he had become quite the opposite. He would talk, but he never chattered. I could ask him about anything that I wanted to know and get a concise answer, but he never talked randomly or just to fill a silence. He was a man of silence, and he wore it like a cloak. A couple of stories I remember sharply illustrate this quality in him. Two men once came all the way from Delhi to Tiruvannamalai especially to meet him, and my mother seated them all on the veranda while she carried on with her work. After about an hour, hearing no sound from outside, she assumed the men had left and came out. She was startled to see the three of them still sitting together in silence, and she hastened to make conversation. They wanted to ask him many questions but were nervous or shy of initiating a discussion. When they eventually did leave, my mother asked him why he hadn't spoken to them, why in fact he had left them sitting in silence for so long. He had no idea why she was upset. He said that he thought they wanted to be quiet, but that if they had anything to talk to him about, they only had to say so. Some time after I had left home and was living with my husband in Pakistan, I came back on a visit. I had bought some old coins in the bazaar in Peshawar, and I showed them to him, explaining that I had been told they were from the reign of some ancient king. He looked at them and said that one of the coins was certainly of a much later date than I suppose. How do you know? I asked him. I didn't think you were interested in old coins. I'm not, he told me, but the date is written on the coin. It is written in Arabic. I exclaimed. I didn't know you could read Arabic. Why didn't you ever tell me? Well, you never asked me, was his reply. He had in fact learned the language many years before but had not used it for a long time. In all those years it had never occurred to him to mention that he spoke yet another language apart from Polish and French, and for all I know several more that I hadn't asked him about. As I said, he was not a man of many words, but those that he did speak were worth listening to. My mother was also deeply devoted to Bhagavan, although hers was more an intuitive devotion. Her instinct was sure. When my father was interned in Bangkok at the beginning of the Second World War, she had not one single word from him for 2 years, and then a telegram came from the War Ministry to say that he had been killed. At the time we were staying with our friends the Sharmas in Madras. Mrs. Sharma was terribly upset on my mother's behalf and tried to comfort her. My mother was relatively calm. She kept saying, "Don't worry, it is a mistake. If Arthur were dead I would know it. I know he is not dead. It is a mistake." Of course they all thought that she was unbalanced with grief, and Mrs. Sharma was so upset by this seemingly irrational behavior that my mother ended up trying to comfort her, while she herself remained unwavering in her belief that her husband was alive. And sure enough, a few days later there was another telegram saying in effect that they had got the wrong Osborne. Her intuition guided her, and her faith in Bhagavan, who, when my little brother Adam asked him to keep his daddy safe, had assented. This, and her own instinct, gave her the knowledge and the fortitude to sense the truth and to recognize the mistake for what it was. Later we got all his letters simultaneously, and apparently he also only heard from us after 2 years. V is the oldest of the three of us and the only one who could write or who, in fact, remembered my father. I was allowed to send my own letters, although there was a rule that each one should be no longer than 25 words. I spent a lot of time trying very hard to fit all that I had to say into that allocation, and I would save up the things I wanted to tell him and practice distilling them into very few words. This did not seem as difficult then as it does in retrospect, as children seem to be born with the ability to accept whatever life offers and to take it for granted. We lose this talent as we grow up and then have to work hard to reclaim it. Now I feel how very distressing it must have been for both my parents to keep going in the face of such a long silence. Luckily they had Bhagavan. The years after he came home from the war were, for us children, a great joy. Our almost mythical daddy was back with us and we reveled in it. He brought a new perspective into our lives. My mother had struggled alone throughout the war with 3 very small children and an uncertain future. She was, for us, the sole authority, and it was sometimes difficult for her to cope with our constant ability to get up to mischief. With the arrival of my father, our horizons broadened. We loved his wisdom and his innate sense of justice. We loved his subtle sense of humor and the way he would tease our mother with an absolutely straight face until we all burst out laughing, her too. Looking back, I sensed that the pleasure my parents felt at the end of their long separation brought laughter into our lives. My father was an enthusiastic gardener, and I enjoyed walking round with him in the mornings as he observed all the growing things and tended to them. He knew by instinct what each plant needed, and he inculcated in me a love of gardens that I have never lost. We would sometimes sit outside at night and he pointed out the various stars and constellations. He also told me stories from mythology that fascinated me as much as they had enthralled him as a child. When we were little, he told us the most wonderful bedtime tales. There was the ongoing saga of a pixie that lived in a magnolia flower and traveled on moonbeams. Astonishing though it might seem, the 3 of us began to look forward to bedtime. He was a natural storyteller. Many years later, when I came home for a long visit with my little daughter Aruna, we were concerned about her missing too much schooling, so my father undertook to teach her English and history. They sat outside on the veranda, his deep voice telling her stories and her childish treble interjecting an occasional question. He made it all so interesting that I sat myself in the doorway inside, out of sight, in order to listen. My mother was sitting in the same position in the other room. She caught my eye and smiled, and then she put her finger to her lips and we were joined in a conspiracy of silence. At the time when my parents were seeking for a spiritual path, it was not at all a popular point of view. Nowadays, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the dangerous and materialistic world we live in, more and more people are interested in finding a deeper truth. Inadequate gurus or bogus sects unfortunately lead many astray. Bhagavan said often that we are not the body. His teaching is as valid and alive today as it was when he sat in the hall wearing a body for all to see. For my father, his coming to Tiruvannamalai was an affirmation of his quest, and having confirmed that Bhagavan was his guru, he never looked back. After retiring from his work in Calcutta, he founded and edited the Mountain Path until his health gave out. Knowing he couldn't continue, he prepared and left in perfect order 10 editorials which were for whoever was to follow him. As it happens, my mother took on this task for a time, which was especially difficult for her as English was not her mother tongue. She did it out of love and loyalty until her health too gave out. Their relationship, a union of opposites, was crucial to both their lives, and my father's last words were to her. He said, "Thank you." Then he died as he had lived, without fuss, and he is buried in the garden he created and loved. He was only 64. The war years had taken their toll of him, and also the intensity of his inner quest placed an enormous strain on his body because he made no compromise. The precious legacy he left us is in his writing. We can travel with him along the road and experience how he dealt with the problems that beset all of us. Reading again of his inner life and struggle, I am heartened that an ordinary human being could find in himself such steadfastness and such ability to remain resolute in the face of all obstacles. It is surely an example to anyone on the mountain path. The 31st of December 2001, Bhagavan's 122nd Jayanti Katya, Douglas, Tiruvannamalai. Contents chapter page publishers note E forward IV1 beginnings 1-2 A station pass through 4. 3 change of course 8. 4 Oxford rejected 12-5 down to the nadir 22-6 marriage 26-7 the quest begins 29-8 adventures on the path 45-9 tribulation 69-10 Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi 89-11 I become a writer and cease to be 115-12 brief eternity 134-13 retirement 143-14 continued quest 152 addendum poems a testament 171 the Guru 183 to Arunachala 184 to Bhagavan 186 brief eternity 189 the tiger 190 the Indler 2 190 poems Khan TD page the initiatic death 191 the dark night 192 desolation 193 the lady of Shalott 194 complete your work 195 the sleeping beauty 196 Anatta 197 the two windows 198 to whom 199 the world 200 the world 201 the Shakti 202 ergo non-sum 202 the dream self 203 others 204 the expanse 205 fantastic things 206 to Christians 207 what remains 208 the song 209 this dream 210 the poet 211 day and night 212 the waning moon 213 the elixir of youth 214 otherness 215 the wind 217 1 beginnings as a small boy there were 3 books that I read over and over again the Knights of King Arthur, Asgard and the Gods and the Arabian Nights. It was King Arthur that was my favorite. My mother had a leather-bound edition that she had acquired as a school prize, and there was not a page of it without my grubby finger marks. Next in preference came the Norse legends. The more sophisticated mythology of Greece never appealed to me, but there was a wild grandeur about that of the Norsemen that stirred me so deeply that it has remained in my memory ever since. The arrogant immensity of the giants in the time of their ascendancy, so that even a blow of Thor's hammer was felt no more than an acorn falling on the brow. And then the return of Thor to power. How the giants had stolen his hammer Mjolnir and hidden it deep within the earth and would only return it at the price of Odin's daughter as bride to one of them. How the gods tricked them, dressing Thor up in bride's clothes and sending him veiled to their palace. Even through the veil, too, the flash of his eyes could be seen. Then the story grew tense as the bridegroom asked for the veil to be removed, but the pretended bride insisted that Mjolnir should be first placed in her lap. Then, when this was done, how Thor laughed aloud and tore off the veil as he rose to his feet, brandishing Mjolnir, and how he left their whole palace in smoking ruins. This and the more tragic stories, the killing of Balder the Beautiful, the treachery of Loki, the rise of his fearsome sons from the underworld, and the end of everything in the last terrible battle of Ragnarok. As I grew older, I began vaguely to feel the mystery of symbolism behind the stories. Indeed, it is remarkable all 3 books should have been allegories of the universal doctrines of the quest. Not only did I read these stories, but I constantly made up my own, especially about King Arthur and his knights, telling them to myself while walking or doing things. This was my secret. I never told anyone about it. Unknowingly, I must have been telling the stories in verse, because I remember puzzling why it was that if I added one word, that is one syllable, the sentence sounded wrong, while if I added 2 it sounded right again. The time came when I began to consider these imaginings as sin and resolved to stop them, but try as I would I always slipped back into them. Once, as a penance and a constant reminder, I decided to wear a knotted cord around my loins, as I had read of medieval monks doing. So I found an old piece of garden rope, made knots in it, and tied it tightly round my waist. However, this gave me stomachache and I could not think of any other way of tying that would hold up, so I abandoned the idea. A favorite daydream at this time was of some mighty king in a far-off land in time and space. Many people came to free him, bringing all imaginable wealth and pleasures, and then I would come in a monk's robe offering him renunciation and hardship. I was to discover later that the king was the ego enthroned amid the pleasures of this world and then bidden to renounce and set forth on the lonely quest. All this does not mean that I was a morose or gloomy child. On the contrary, I was exuberant, as a Sagittarian should be, fun-loving, delighted when visitors came or when we went out anywhere. Only there was this inner current of life also, and it was something I did not speak about. Extrovert or introvert? I do not believe the definitions are anywhere near so widely applicable as commonly supposed. A person of high vitality is often both, a person of low vitality neither. Certainly I was both to a high degree. S.G. 2A station passed through T. The next powerful influence on my life was the Yorkshire moors. Perhaps it could be described as a vision of beauty, the long sweep of the hills, the heather glowing purple in the distance and springy underfoot, the profusion of wild flowers, marsh orchids, and many others, the wild strawberries growing by the roadside and, above all, the somber pine woods with the wind moaning through them. And yet I had known beautiful country before and have known it since, and never had it such power over me. I loved it in rain and mist as well as in sunshine. It became connected in my mind with the Norse legends and the virile power of the Northlands. It seemed something too sacred to speak about, and I never did speak about it. The last time we spent our summer holidays there I must have been about 15. The spell was as strong as ever. It was then that I wrote my first sonnet. I was sitting alone on a hillside and took out a new notebook that I happened to have in my breast pocket and wrote a sonnet about the moors on the first 5 page. I decided to write one on each page and give it to my mother for a birthday present when it was full. I don't know whether I ever wrote another poem in it. I certainly never gave it to anyone. In the same holiday I wrote a lyric on the moors and the pine trees that I long regarded as a great poem. Juvenile as it was written with genuine inspiration. I have long since forgotten it. The same holiday we made friends with a local farmer, whom I will call Bob Thorpe, an uncouth-looking fellow, and shaven, with a broad North Riding accent, and yet a great lover of beauty and a reader of poetry. When he sat on a hillside beside me, reciting Tennyson and Milton, there was much less of an accent in his speech. He too loved the moorlands. Instead of a compact farm in the valley around his farmhouse, he had his fields scattered on the various hills because he loved walking from hill to hill. There were those who said that it was also because it gave him an excuse for walking over the squire's grounds and that he left a trail of rabbit snares as he went. In fact, poaching was as much a business with him as farming. I never liked games, neither cricket and football nor the lighter games such as tennis and badminton. I played as much as was inescapable at school and no more. On the other hand, I loved gardening. We had an orchard behind the house and a garden for growing flowers and vegetables, and my father and I did all the work of it. Whether it was the heavy work of digging and manuring or sowing seeds, pruning fruit trees, even weeding, I loved the very contact with the earth and the growing things. When, therefore, harvest started and Bob Thorpe let me work for him as an unpaid laborer, it was he who was doing me a favor. We worked from first daylight to dusk, taking time off at midday to rest in the shade and eat the cold 6 meat that the womenfolk brought to the field for us. It was an old-fashioned, simple reaper and we bound the sheaves by hand and arranged them in stooks. I had never spent so enjoyable a holiday. Farming appealed to me and might have fulfilled my nature, but my father had other plans for me and would not consider such a possibility. When I say that this outcome, supposing it to have been possible, would have been the only fulfillment of my life, that does not mean that missing it was a cause for regret. Indeed, it was a cause for rejoicing. The only real measure of success in life is the state of mind and character one has attained when the time comes to leave it. The only full success is spiritual enlightenment, realization of the self. The life in a man is returning ineluctably to its source, to oneness with the self, like a river to the ocean. This lifetime is an episode on the path, and all that matters is the distance from the goal when the episode ends. This depends on two things. First, on the position from which this lifetime begins, that is to say the stage on the road already attained in past existences, whether human or not. Secondly, on the wisdom and determination with which one presses forward in this lifetime. There is no injustice in the different stages from which man begins life's course or in the different degrees of understanding and determination with which they are endowed, for that concerns only speed, and impatience is a purely human disease. The difference does not affect the universal order or the final outcome. Indeed, from the viewpoint of the universal order, the courses man follows can be compared rather to rivers flowing into the ocean than to men trudging the road on a pilgrimage, a lifetime representing not the whole course of the river but only a certain stretch of it. 7. Even though some meander or stagnate or even turn backwards, while others flow swift and strong, all plunge finally into the same ocean. There is not even any question of earlier or later, since time does not come into it when the river's courses are viewed as a whole from the air. But for the individual, time does make a difference. So long as he feels himself to be an individual, the striving is real, and it is the symbol of the pilgrim that applies, not that of the river. And for the pilgrim, wasted time is wasted opportunity. A whole lifetime, a whole day's journey on the pilgrimage, may be wasted, idling by the roadside, wandering afield, or even going back, and then the next day's journey will be more arduous and its starting point less advantageous. It is true that by no means all envisage life as a purposeful journey. Happy are those who do and who act on the knowledge, but even those who do not are advancing or regressing according to whether they weaken or strengthen the grip of the ego, cutting some of its tentacles or putting out new ones. Fundamentally, the weakening and final dissolution of the ego is the purpose of all religions, and it is religion which is the most efficacious for accomplishing this task, although selfless service of others, and even of animals and plants, can also be effective to some extent. Whatever weakens the ego is good, whatever strengthens it bad. Thus, it may be advantageous for a person to be uprooted rather than to strike root. Certainly it was for me. If destiny had closed the circle, leading me to contentment on a Yorkshire farm, the journey might have ended there and this lifetime been wasted. As it happened, this episode was like a station that the train stops at long enough to look out of the window and then travels on. 3. Change of course. I never went back to the moors. Life now took a new course. The beacon ahead to which I steered was an Oxford scholarship. I have the methodical tenacity in pursuing a goal which one would expect of a moon in Capricorn. At present the goal was an idealized Oxford, later it was to be the supreme goal of Nirvana. Between the two intervened a period with no envisaged goal, when I tossed adrift on a stormy sea. At present Oxford seemed like an alabaster city of dreams in the mists ahead, and I aimed steadily at getting there. Not only was it the gateway to a good career but, in itself, a haven of culture from the bleak money cult of the West Riding. In fact, refusal to accept a materialist world was already working in my mind and, the true alternative having not yet been described, an idealized Oxford served as an imaginary substitute for it. My school trained boys in classics, science and mathematics, but an enthusiastic history master captured my interest and got the headmaster's permission to coach me for history. 9. Scholarship. That was before the day of the welfare state, when a country grant came automatically to all who obtained entrance to a university. For me it was a scholarship or nothing. Side by side with persistent study I found time for other reading also, philosophical writers like Ruskin and Carlyle, though not pure philosophy. Theology as well, such as the works of Dean Ing, who was then in vogue, also much poetry. My special delight was when I was left alone in the house and was able to read poetry aloud. I also enjoyed whatever humor came my way, Pickwick, the plays of W. S. Gilbert, the Ingoldsby Legends. Except for an occasional humorous novel, I read no fiction. It seemed a waste of time with so much knowledge to acquire and philosophy to ponder. Although little enough spending money came my way, I began to accumulate a small library. I thought of myself as a future writer. Looking round at the sunset sky from a windy hill one evening, the conviction came to me with the intensity of a revelation. I could write poems if there were anything important enough to write about. Several times in the course of my life I recalled this, saying, surely what I feel now is important enough. But it never was. On another occasion, walking across the fields into town, I had a strange dream that I should someday write a book that would begin in prose and then, attaining too high a vibration for prose, continue in poetry, and finally transcend speech altogether, ending in silence. There were no buses on the roads in those days, and it was a 2-mile walk to school in the morning and back in the evening, often 4 times a day when I came home for lunch. I must have been about 16 when, as I was walking home one day, a vivid and intense feeling of the reality of death came over. 10 me. Why should I accumulate a library? Why should I accumulate anything at all, when death was inevitable? There was nothing sad or tragic about the thought and no fear. It was not a feeling of despondency or revolt, but simply of the inevitability of death. It passed and effected no permanent change, but at least it left an impression too vivid to fade. It was at the same age that an experience of death overwhelmed Ramana, who was to become the Maharshi, and destroyed his ego once and for all, leaving him thenceforth established immutably in the self. See my Ramana Maharshi in the Path of Self-Knowledge, page 18 to 19, Ryder and Company. It is very seldom that the path can thus be completed in a single step, only in those rare cases where obstacles have already been overcome in a previous life, leaving the ultimate attainment within grasp. More often it is a path of striving for a lifetime, seldom indeed brought to a conclusion before life ends. However, it may be natural for the first intuition of it to occur at this age, when the mind is already fully active and worldly unwisdom has not yet closed over it like a dense cloud, hiding the face of reality. Religion already meant a lot to me. At this time I came under the influence of a Welsh clergyman called Morgan, a spare but powerfully built man, dominating and combative, utterly dedicated and tense with nervous energy. That he was a boxing blue and an authority on rugby football impressed me not at all, that he was a keen wit very much. He ran into opposition through introducing beauty into his church and its services. Typical of him was that he painted the pews bright green instead of the usual dull brown, saying that he wanted to wake people up when they came into the church, not put them to sleep. To give us courage he introduced street processions and small prayer meetings conducted by laymen, and I took 11 part in both. I had read Gitanjali and its sequel, Tagore's books of prose poems, and was fascinated by them as the nearest thing to mystical knowledge I had yet found, though how far distant from it I was layered to understand, and foreshadowing of things to come. At one such prayer meeting that I conducted I read out a poem by Tagore and explained that, although not a Christian, he had the same faith and understanding. Those present expressed agreement. The second strong influence on me at that time was Mr. Lance, my history master. He was a loyal son of Christ Church and eager that I should go there too. However, the Oxford colleges were divided into 3 groups for scholarship purposes, and in my year the Christ Church group came last of the 3. It would be obviously too reckless to wait for that, so he suggested my going up to try for a scholarship a year early. The headmaster agreed that it would be useful for me to have the experience, not that there was any chance of my getting in. It was, however, pointed out to me that it was unwise for a boy from a grammar school like ours to put Christ Church first on his list of preferences. He would not be chosen anyway, and it would make the colleges he had put lower down on the list less likely to accept him. However, I stuck to my guns, or rather to Mr. Lance's guns. In the autumn of 1924 I went up to Oxford as a scholar of Christ Church, just turned 18, a year before my time. 4 Oxford rejected my tutors let me know that they were grooming me for a fellowship of All Souls and a career as an Oxford Don. For 2 years I went along with them, and then in the 3rd year almost stopped work, cut myself off from college and the university life, and in general made myself unacceptable. I was conceited enough to think that I could easily make a living by writing whether I had a profession or not. I was becoming profoundly disillusioned with Oxford and more incompatible. I had therefore no goal at which to aim. That of going to Oxford had been achieved. That now proposed, of an academic career, failed to appeal, and the true goal of life had not yet been revealed. I had expected more of Oxford than it could give. A home of culture where men were interested in all that could not be bought for money. I threw myself into the new life with enthusiasm. I was assiduous in attending lectures, studying in libraries and in my room, composing essays for my bi-weekly tutorials. I also plunged eagerly into the new social life. Scarcely 13 a day passed without my being invited out or inviting others to my rooms. However, before even the first term ended, there was a chill feeling of disillusionment. Where I had expected understanding I found triviality. Gradually I withdrew upon myself until, by the end of my 3rd year, there were not half a dozen people in the whole university whom I knew well enough to drop in on uninvited. I shrank back from Oxford life. Never spoke in the Union, though fond of debating, never acted in the OUDS, though attracted to the stage, never wrote for the ISIS or Cherwell, whichever it was called, the University Weekly, although I considered myself a writer. The inner rejection extended to studies as well as people. History had held my interest at school partly as the pageant of great men and events and partly as a study of long-term developments, but when it was offered to me in the guise of research work, spending months deciphering the rent rolls of a 12th century village in order to write a thesis on the economic basis of medieval land tenure, ferreting out all the references to a 10th-rate Tudor politician whom I should not be interested to meet if he lived today, and when this was proposed to me as an occupation in life, I shrank back from it. Twice in future years I was to find that when I saw a field of knowledge to possess intrinsic value I could read voraciously and study meticulously, but not just research for its own sake, not amassing details about some question that I felt to be unimportant and in which I was uninterested. I quite realized, of course, that history or any other discipline of modern learning, sociology, astronomy, marine biology, whatever it may be, advances through the endless, patient, often anonymous research of scholars working either in battalions or deployed singly to strategic points, much of 14 their work infructuous but some of it producing results which can modify a whole theory or inaugurate a hypothesis. To doubt the importance of such research would be to reject the very basis of modern civilization. I do not reject it. That does not mean that I advocate wearing handloom cloth or working by candlelight or any such puerilities. So long as one lives in the modern world it is senseless not to conform to its outer conditions. What is to be rejected is its sense of values, its conviction of its own superiority and belief in the intrinsic worth of the sciences on which it is based, in fact its whole Weltanschauung. If the rejection of that were sufficiently widespread it would lead to rejection of its outer forms also, but that is not likely to happen easily or peacefully. In the social order based on a real respect for human nature, which includes appreciation of man's spiritual potentialities, a man's work for the community involves his inner development also. If he is a craftsman making furniture or building houses, his work is an art and he takes pride in its completion. It is also based on a symbolism reflecting his own self-building. If he is a student, his studies tend to the development of his understanding and burgeoning of his character, rectifying warped or stunted tendencies in him. But the modern mechanical civilization uses men as instruments, whether they be laborers or scholars. Just as a workman tends to his machines with no consideration for his own development, so a scholar contributes his fragment of research totally alien to wisdom or self-knowledge. It is not true that society is greater than a man, nor is it expedient that one man should die for the good of the people. An anthill is greater than the single ants that compose it, but man has a divinity in his nature which potentially contains and transcends this whole world, and a society which denies this by treating 15 men as instruments, providing no means for their spiritual development, is eating out its own vitals, leaving itself an empty shell. Traditionally, it has always been held that the search for truth or knowledge is sacred and requires no motive or justification, that is, a fit end to which to devote one's life. That is true, but it refers to knowledge of direct or indirect spiritual import, knowledge which gradually illumines or transforms the seeker. To speak in the same terms of the accumulation of mere factual knowledge is a parody, and that is what is done. I did not know all this at the time, but I intuitively rejected research as a sterile use to which to put one's years of life. I intuitively rejected modern civilization, not indeed with any knowledge of its sickness, not knowing that my antipathy to it was more than poetic and romantic, but with a deep feeling of its inadequacy. I did not know what I wanted of Oxford, but I felt bitterly that I had not found it. To some extent I knew. I knew that I wanted spiritual guidance. The answer to that would be that it is not Oxford's purpose to supply this. That is true, but a deeper countercurrent would be that a country or civilization whose highest center of learning and culture is indifferent to spiritual values, neither inculcating nor denying them, simply ignoring them, is in a very bad way. Here were young men receiving the best education their country had to offer, some of them studying its language and literature, others its history, and all in utter ignorance of its majestic traditions, of the intrepid strivings of its mystics, the paths to beatitude that they had trod and the final supreme achievement, the mystic union. Ignorant not merely of their actual testimony but of their very existence, not even knowing that there was a goal to life, that there were paths leading to it. 16 and that men had trod these paths and left records of their ascent. One of my friends took Sanskrit for his degree, and he also, during his years of study, was never let into the secret that there is anything of spiritual interest in Sanskrit literature. It is remarkable how all doors to spiritual growth were closed to me at this time, or opened only to reveal a bleak, cheerless interior. At first I joined one or two others from my college in going to weekly evangelical meetings in town. We sat on upright chairs in a bare room while impromptu prayers were said, and someone gave a talk on being saved and what a wonderful experience it was. Well, I thought, it must be a wonderful experience for him, but I don't seem to have it. So I stopped going. During most of my first year I attended morning chapel instead of roll call, 20 minutes instead of 2. I was usually the only person there. I also went to some special kind of evening service that was held in the chapel once or twice a week. But it seemed cold and lifeless and meant nothing to me, and I gradually stopped going. Neither the college chaplain nor any other ecclesiastic, and there were some, because Christ Church Chapel is also Oxford Cathedral, offered any help or encouragement or even seemed aware of my seeking. During one vacation I went to stay at the Christ Church Mission in East London. It was doing useful social work, but there was nothing spiritual about it. I visited an Anglo-Catholic priory but felt no atmosphere such as might impel me to probe deeper. I toyed with the idea of Catholicism, but more for its poetic than its religious appeal. I made friends with the 2 Indian undergraduates at my college, one a Hindu and the other a Muslim, and became a frequent visitor at the Majlis, the Indian Undergraduates Club, with the vague hope, based on recollections of Tagore, that it would lead to some spiritual 17 contact, but nothing of the sort transpired. Most Indians abroad either reject their spiritual heritage or are reticent about it, fearful of not being considered modern. I joined a mystic society which was to have weekly meetings with talks on various branches of mysticism. The first meeting was held at Balliol in the rooms of Anthony Matthew, one of the few friends I had at Oxford, a delightful person, heavy in build, light and graceful in manner, sociable and aloof at the same time. Some wealthy members of the club had brought a gong with a deep, mellow tone to announce the beginning of the meeting. Anthony provided mulled claret and Turkish and Egyptian cigarettes. The gong was struck and the talk started. A South African scholar, a few years older than the rest of us and said to be immensely learned in such matters, was giving a talk on the Buddha. It was entirely made up of trivialities and contained nothing whatever of spiritual interest. And that was the end. The club never met again because it turned out that none of us knew anything to talk about. I never heard what happened to the gong. In distress I wrote to Morgan to ask him what he had done about spiritual thinking when he was at Oxford, and he wrote back that he hadn't done any. A chill came over me as I read that. It seemed a betrayal. Even Rosamond offered no help in this direction. I wrote to her that I was determined to understand Christ's miracles, and she ignored that part of my letter in her reply. Perhaps, as a devout Catholic, she felt that faith was enough and that it was sacrilegious to want to understand. Rosamond was a serene and gracious person, reminiscent of green lawns and summer flowers, far from the somber pine woods of the north. Scholarly, Interested in art and poetry, she was at the same time normal and sensible, all that I was not. We were old friends as soon as we met. I felt that I had 18 known her always, yet I never thought of asking her to marry me. Looking back, I can see that there were several occasions when my mind might at a touch have turned in that direction, but the touch was never given. In fact, all might have beens are an illusion. What did not happen never really lay within the bounds of possibility. Rosamond's conviction that I should become a great poet was bracing. The frustration that I met with on every side in seeking spiritual guidance led me to turn more enthusiastically to poetry. In my second year, Denzel Batchelor came up and we immediately became close friends. He was a young man with shining brown eyes and a glowing voice, full of glory and tragedy. His energy was prodigious: poetry, football, drink, work, social life, and always tragically in love. I never doubted that he was one of the world's great poets, and this also made it easier for me to believe that I was another. I even followed suit in persuading myself that I was a tragic lover, choosing for the purpose an actress 10 years my senior whom I had scarcely spoken to. Only many years later, going over such scraps of Denzel's poems as had stuck in my memory, did I realize that they were just melodious words, saying nothing. My own were not even that. Even apart from personal ability, there was the question of the spirit of the age, a force as impalpable but almost as binding as the law of averages. If you toss a coin, it is equally likely to come down heads or tails, and if you toss it 100 times, this applies equally each single time. Therefore, in theory, it should be equally likely to come down heads all the 100 times. But in fact, the law of averages is so rigorous that it will not vary more than 2 or 3 times either side of 50. Similarly, it should theoretically be possible for a Tennyson to 19 flourish in the age of Pope or a Pope in the age of Tennyson, but it does not happen so. Even when a writer seems to be out of touch with the spirit of the age or voluntarily hostile to it, he will usually be found to represent either an underground current of opposition or the rising tide of tomorrow beating on the crumbling cliffs of yesterday. In the 20s of this century, in the disillusionment following the First World War, cacophony was a desideratum of style and sophisticated superficiality of content. Neither Denzel nor I had the cast of mind or the approach to poetry that was then called modern. There were indeed 2 directions in which some living aspiration was being canalized, but neither of them affected us, or so far as I was aware, the Oxford of our time. One was communism. It was the age when enthusiasts turned hopefully to communism as a blueprint for a new utopia, only to be disillusioned later by the stark reality. The other was the spiritual revolt against materialist, mechanized modern civilization which was already flowing in many streams, for which I was searching half unwittingly and wholly in vain. After leaving Oxford I was isolated from the trend of things, at first of necessity and later from choice, and when, in the 50s, I was ready to write my books, the streams had swollen to torrents. The development of myself had to some extent been reflected in the world, so that I found myself expressing the spirit of a new age, and the books that I was then in a condition to write were such as the publishers were looking for. This does not mean, of course, that the world of today can be called spiritual. The very idea is ludicrous, but it does not mean that the anti-spiritual trend that set in with the Renaissance has run its course, terminating in the total denial of the age of Darwin, Marx and Freud, which communism seeks to perpetuate, and that an opposite current is now flowing. 20 Back to a sense of spiritual reality. It is still a minority movement, as every Renaissance must be, but if these were normal times one might regard it as the wave of the future. However, they are not, and it may be that the world as we know it has no future, that this is the time of separation which Christ foretold long ago, between those who reject all wisdom and guidance, clinging only to the superficialities of life, and those who turn back with renewed energy in quest of meaning. I had a contemporary at Christ Church who had real skill in writing verse and who was, moreover, in accord with the spirit of the age, and he therefore became famous as a poet. That was W. H. Auden. I knew him by sight but do not recollect ever speaking to him. Writer or not, Oxford was not my destiny. It would have been as great a tragedy, as much the waste of a lifetime, if the circle had closed there as if it had closed earlier on a Yorkshire farm. It was an intuitive recognition that it would have been evading the fight of whose existence I did not yet know and accepting instead an easy establishment. However, I could not explain this to anyone at the time because I did not know it myself. To say that someone's destiny is not in a certain port does not absolve him from responsibility for the navigation. In spiritual things, statements which appear contradictory can both be true, expressing different aspects or levels of truth. For instance, Christ could say, from one standpoint, that evil must needs come, but he could immediately follow it up from another with a denunciation of those through whom it comes, which would be illogical and unjust if both statements were made from the same standpoint. Similarly, the Quran states that evildoers can act as they do only by the divine will, and yet in another place it 21 denounces them for putting forward this very plea in their own defense. The former viewpoint is cosmic and the latter individual, and each are valid on its own plane. Actually, there is also a third standpoint, higher than either, the metaphysical, but from that the question of responsibility does not arise. To revert to a symbol used earlier in this book, the former is like viewing a landscape from the air, when the entire course of the river exists simultaneously in the eternal present, the timeless now. The latter is like a man in a boat, for whom the part of the river already navigated is past and that ahead is future. The course that lies ahead of him may be already marked on the map, but he has not access to the map and does not know what it is. Also, it is not drawn by any arbitrary whim but is due to the lie of the land, the force of the current and the obstacles interposed to its flow. Had I possessed spiritual understanding at this time, I could have remained at Oxford without betrayal, or sought a position elsewhere, or simply left everything to take its course. As it was, my staying on would have been a betrayal, but my making no other provision was an act not of faith but improvidence. It is the motive that makes an act right or wrong. Unfortunately, a man can seldom mismanage his own life without hurting others also. C.S. Copyright 5 down to the nadir XHE. Last term ended and I packed up and left. I did not even trouble to attend the official degree-taking ceremony. An immediate income became necessary, no use thinking any longer of future royalties on unwritten books. With some difficulty I obtained a post in a 10th-grade boarding school. The life was uncongenial, but even so it never occurred to me to regret not having stayed on at Oxford. I was seriously considering becoming a Catholic in order to renounce the world and enter a monastery. Before taking up my teaching post, I called at the Catholic church in my hometown to talk it over with the local priest. To my surprise, I found this a flourishing institution with several incumbents. I was fortunate in contacting their Father Daly, an Irish Jesuit with an adventurous spirit, a simple, good-hearted man with whom I had more affinity than I should have had with someone of a more scholarly type. He was elderly then and retired to a more sedentary post owing to a weak heart, but most of 23 his life he had spent in tropical Africa. He advised me that, if I made the decision, I should find the Benedictine order most suited to my temperament. I went for a number of doctrinal talks with him. The thing I found hardest to swallow was Adam's apple. I was told that I must believe that it was the sin of physical greed over a physical apple that caused the fall. Even though I knew nothing yet of religious symbolism, I felt intuitively that this was a sterile parody of a profound truth. However, the scheme was not rejected for this or any other doctrinal reason but was gradually pushed aside during the months that followed by the zest for life in me. Which means simply that the spiritual impetus was too weak, for when the real doorway opened several years later it called forth an aspiration against which no worldly zest could stand. Within a year I had to give up my job on account of illness. When I recovered, the Oxford University Appointments Board informed me of two possibilities, one at an Italian archaeological college in Palestine, and the other as a private tutor in a Polish country family. I applied for both and both accepted me. The former was a chance to retrieve my position in an academic career, the latter was a dead end. However, the former refused to advance my passage money. They were willing to refund it when I arrived, but I had not got it. I was no longer on good terms with my father, so instead of asking him for it straight out, I asked his advice which job to take. He advised the Polish one. He was a practical, level-headed person, so I could only wonder what his motive was in advising what he must have known to be the wrong choice. Whether it was because of the passage money or because the college was Catholic, and knowing my leaning in that direction, he feared that I might be lost forever to a religion he abominated. Actually, if I had 24 put the matter plainly to him, asking him outright to advance me the fare, I do not think he would have refused. There were also one or two other people who would probably have made the advance if I had asked them, but it never occurred to me to do so. I followed my destiny to Poland. For nearly a year I lived in a Polish manorial house on a large estate, read little, wrote next to nothing, met few people, more or less stagnated. At the end of that time I got a job helping with an evening school in the Upper Silesian mining and industrial town of Katowice. When I got there I found that it was not really an evening school at all. Only a lecturer in English at Krakow University, a cautious, dapper little man, had started evening courses in English at Katowice, where he came by train 2 or 3 times a week to run them. The courses prospered. There was a boom in English owing to American industrial investment. He was glad to have an Englishman, and an Oxford graduate at that, to help him, but was too prudent to mention the fact in his advertisements. Only his own name appeared. Next year, however, the beginnings of the post-war crisis began to be felt. The demand for English slumped and the courses could no longer support two. Within 3 years of leaving Oxford I had come right down to the nadir. No job, no profession, no prospects, just making a living by giving private lessons to foreigners. Apart from the outer conditions, I was degenerating in myself also, tending to become superficial in life and cynical in outlook. The attempt to find an answer in religion had failed, and I no longer even went to church or read religious or philosophical books. The dream of being a professional writer had not materialized. I had wanted to write. Even the dream of a great 25 love seemed to have eluded me and degenerated into a facile attraction to women. Nevertheless, some parts of the fortress still held idealism and a sense of honor and great simplicity. Actually, I had been shielded from the world during this time of decline when it would have been easy to lose grip. First in a boarding school, then a sick bed, then a country house. Only now was I cast onto the waters of modern city life and in danger of dissipating my energies 100 ways, with resultant weakening and superficiality. However, I had been a very short time in Katowice before my attention began to be concentrated on a lady of great charm and poise who came to the courses. She was tall and well-built, with a pale complexion and dark, wavy hair. What first attracted me was an impression of great self-control and something secret about her eyes and smile betokening hidden wealth of personality. I was soon in love and decided that this was the wife for me. Such was my exuberance and folly that it did not even occur to me what a poor offer I was as a husband in view of the mess I had made of my life. 6. Marriage. My marriage was the first wise thing I ever did. Even materially, it marked the end of the descent and the beginning of the upward swing, for soon after it was agreed I received an offer of a post as English master at a government college for training ship's officers and engineers in the new port of Gdynia. They were looking for a suitable person and someone had mentioned my name. It was quite a while before it was agreed upon, because the lady was not at first convinced. The perseverance and one-pointedness to convince her was a sort of rehearsal for the spiritual training to come later. Even at the time I felt it to be a process of strengthening like the forging of steel through fire. An indication of her nobility of character was that my lack of job or prospects was not one of the things that made her hesitate. She herself was working at the time as a secretary and translator to the general manager of a large combine. This was also the time when I made my last serious attempt at poetry with a long philosophical poem in blank verse. There. 27 were occasional flashes of insight in it. For instance, after writing of man's insignificance when the whole earth on which he lives is no more than a speck of dust in the cosmos, I went on to refute this view by bringing in the conception of infinity, which dissolves differences of magnitude, being infinitely greater than the greatest as well as the least. Man is not small compared with the vast skies when, in the infinite, is neither great nor small. However, it was not good poetry, fortunately not, because it would have been regrettable that one who was layered to write from even theoretical understanding should have confused matters by first publishing his own unguided meanderings. It was in 1932 that we set up house in Gdynia. I ought to have been ideally happy. I was ecstatically in love with my wife, and I had regular work again. The duties were light, only about half a day, and the salary adequate. In any case I supplemented it with lessons at a commercial school and a few private lessons. We had the sea in front and beautiful wooded hills behind. And yet I was restless and dissatisfied. The thought of life lengthening out into an endless drab vista of work and salary pressed down on me like claustrophobia. My father wrote advising me to get back to school in England, because every year I spent abroad was a year wasted from the point of view of increments on the Burnham scale and eventual pension, but that seemed an even more dismal prospect. I could not settle down. I wanted to go off on holidays alone. I labored constantly at the writing of worthless novels and short stories. I felt inwardly bankrupt. I began to incline towards communism, not for any intrinsic merit I found in it, but simply as a challenge to the sham world around me, not even investigating to see. 28. Whether it also was not a sham. Christ said that he who seeks will find. Perhaps for one who does not even know that there is anything to seek, refusal to be satisfied with a meaningless life may be the equivalent of search. A cultural Anglo-Polish society was formed at Gdynia, which held weekly meetings and entertained tourists passing through the town and ship's officers calling there. I wrote and produced humorous one-act plays for it and in their success enjoyed a tawdry imitation of the literary fame I craved. For a while I acted as honorary secretary to the society and then it was decided that the amount of work had increased enough to justify a professional secretary. 4 young men straight from Oxford held the post in succession while we were there, each staying about a year. The first of them was Martin Lings, who became a personal friend of ours. He was a slightly built man of medium height, with a Van Dyke beard and a manner of grave courtesy behind which lay considerable firmness of character. After about a year he left to take up a post as English lecturer at the University of Kaunas in Lithuania. 7. The quest begins. It was in 1936, my 30th year, that the change of course set in. It was high time, because the ship of my life, drifting uncharted, had got into the shallows and almost run aground. In February Catherine was born, our first child. In the summer Martin Lings came to stay with us on his way back from Lithuania, where he had just given up his job. He made the impression on me of having grown argumentative. He tried to prove the Renaissance had been a calamity, which, of course, led to a historical discussion. Then he told me his outlook on history and civilization, and indeed, on life itself, had been totally changed by reading the works of a writer who had complete knowledge. I objected that in modern times knowledge is far too extensive for one man to possess it all, and he explained that he did not mean detailed factual knowledge but integral or essential knowledge. I did not understand what he meant by that and he was unable to explain. Looking back now, it seems extraordinary that he should not have been able. 30. To tell us the simple essence of what a spiritual outlook implies, the oneness of being and the possibility of self-realization. Instead, he asked me to read the books for myself. This I was not prepared to do. I was writing a novel and had no time at present, I told him. He left 2 books with me, asking me to read them when I found time, and I half promised to do so. It was October before I got round to reading the books Martin had left for me. The one I took up first was a book of essays by Ouspensky. I still retained a critical mind and was by no means prepared to accept whatever ivory tower was offered as a refuge from a meaningless life. Some of the things he said interested me, but I made a list of dubious statements, contradictions and unjustified assumptions and sent it to Martin, saying that it was not even accurate or consistent, let alone complete knowledge. He wrote back with some humility, accepting my criticisms, admitting that he might have been wrong about Ouspensky, but asserting that it was the other writer whom he meant when he spoke about writing from knowledge. The other was one of the early books of René Guénon, I think Introduction Générale à l'étude des doctrines hindoues. There was no question of criticism this time. From the very first page I drank it in like someone so parched with thirst that he absorbs moisture through the very pores of his skin. When I came to the sentence, being as one, I felt physically, in my heart, not as a brain thought, this is true. I have always known it was true but didn't know that I knew. That moment, a moment I still clearly envisage, sitting alone in a room, in an armchair in my flat in Gdynia, was the beginning of the quest which I was never again to relinquish, from which I was never to turn aside. For Gwenon left no doubt that it was a quest. If it had been mere theory it would have not interested me, but the implication was kept well. 31 to the 4. Being is one. Therefore you yourself cannot be other than the one being, because there is no other. Therefore to realize your true self is to realize the supreme identity with absolute, universal, eternal being. And this can be done. So life had a meaning after all. It was not a mere inane trickle of events. My restlessness and discontent fell away. My ambition to become a writer evaporated. The goal and purpose of life was clear. Nevertheless a wave of caution rose up. I said to myself, are you prepared to undertake this? Remember that you are not psychic and do not have visions and ecstasy, and it means giving up pleasures that you know to be real for pleasures that may be real. And immediately the answer arose in my mind. It is not a question of pleasure but truth. I have to follow it because it is true. Truth is its own compulsion and I have no option. Before carrying the story further I should say something about Gwenon and his influence. In the second quarter of this century he wrote a series of books and numerous articles expounding the inner unanimity of the religions, or traditions, as he preferred to call them, the meaning of symbolism, the possibilities of initiatic training, and the true hierarchical basis of society or civilization. His teaching can be summarized as follows. Being is one, and therefore by realizing your true self you realize your identity with divine, universal being. This is the essential teaching of all religions, although it may be proclaimed openly, as in the Eastern religions, or veiled and confined to esoteric societies, as in the Western. Therefore all religions are unanimous in their essence, although divergent and even incompatible in their more external applications, that is in doctrine, theology, ritual, and the social organization and code of conduct they sponsor. Every religion, so long as its full spiritual integrity remains, has initiatic organizations in which 32 the aspirant can obtain guidance on the path towards ultimate realization of the supreme identity. These organizations, in order to be valid, must descend in an unbroken chain from the origin. Each guru, since the word guru has been accepted into the English language as signifying spiritual guide, I use it for the sake of convenience in this book, whether it applies to a Hindu guide or any other, being appointed by his predecessor. What the aspirant has to do is to find a guru, no matter in what religion, who has both vertical and horizontal authenticity, that is to say, who is a realized man and also the validly appointed successor to a chain of gurus, and seek initiation and guidance from him. However, having chosen any religion, he must follow it scrupulously in its outer organization of life and worship, its ritual and observances and moral code, as well as its more essential teaching, since each religion is an organic whole. This for the individual, but for the organization of mankind in society he taught no less emphatically that normally and traditionally a spiritual purpose underlies, and a spiritual authority controls, the whole of civilization. Any civilization which breaks away from its spiritual roots and bases itself on rationalist and materialist values is a monstrosity and cannot have stability or endure for long. Therefore our modern civilization, far from being the highest achievement of mankind, is an aberration foredoomed to destruction by its very nature, while our modern sciences consist of such knowledge as traditional civilizations would not have thought worthwhile accumulating, since they have no spiritual basis and do not further the spiritual development of those who acquire them. All this he expounds with brilliant lucidity, vast erudition, and unshakable conviction that he was right and scathing contempt for all who disagreed. 33 He usually was right but not always. For instance, he asserted that no Hindu believes in reincarnation, which he declared to be a travesty of Hinduism invented by modern Western misinterpreters. Even more serious, he dismissed Buddhism as a spurious religion. Bearing in mind his axiom that there is no neutrality in religion, that everything is initiatic or counter-initiatic or in plainer language, of divine or satanic origin, this implies the assumption that the whole of Buddhism, with all its saints and poets, its arhats and bodhisattvas is based on error and evil. He admitted, indeed, that such Buddhist currents as had passed through China had been purified and spiritualized by the Chinese influence, but this involved the assumption that the Chinese sages had chosen a satanic vehicle into which to pour their influence. Before the end of his life he did indeed retract this error, though without admitting that he had previously made it, and even then insofar as concerned Mahayana, which he declared, in defiance of history, to be the original Buddhism. Strangely enough, even errors of this magnitude did little to impair the value of his work. So vast was its sweep, such an affirmation of truth pervaded it, that errors seemed swallowed up in the sea of truth. Not that any of us would have admitted at that time that there were errors. Even though there were, they were due to his faulty application of the principles he proclaimed, whereas the merit of his work was that he did proclaim true principles on which to base the conduct of life, the understanding of its meaning and the judgment of a civilization, instead of personal ideas and prejudices. His influence was less widespread than his clear insight, lucid exposition and vast erudition would have justified. Perhaps this was due to his extreme militancy and refusal to compromise. 34 For instance, an Orientalist who felt vaguely the sublimity of the ancient texts he was handling, without however grasping their meaning and implications with the clarity which Gwenon demanded, and there have been many such, would not be disposed to learn from one who dismissed his whole science as learned ignorance. Similarly, a psychologist who was prepared to admit spiritual springs to men's actions could obviously not express agreement with a writer who denounced modern psychology in toto as a counter-initiatic, by which he meant satanic origin. Even social, political and economic reformers would find little common ground with one who denounced not merely this or that aspect of modernism but modern civilization as a whole, root and branch. However, what his influence lost in scope it gained in profundity, for those who did accept his teaching did so wholeheartedly, many of them indeed, changing not merely their outlook but their whole attitude to life. And in the course of time some of them also began to write and to exert an influence in less tangible ways, thus carrying forward the influence that Gwenon had originated. For myself, I was predisposed to accept his teaching as regarded civilization no less than the meaning and the purpose of life for the individual, since, as I have already said, I had intuitively revolted against the mechanism, materialism and vulgarity of our age and had never really reconciled myself to it. Now at last I had the doctrinal justification of what I had long felt intuitively. How far did the impact of Gwenon immediately change me, and how far did it merely set in motion a lengthy process of change? The theory of conversion changing a man's nature in a twinkling, as held in some Protestant sects, is too facile. 35 deep-rooted tendencies and predispositions are not so easily eradicated. Only in the rarest cases, when a man is already concentrated and already, without knowing it, ripe for self-surrender, will a single mental conviction, a single vision, or even a single flash of realization, as in the case of the Maharshi, suffice to effect an immediate and permanent change. Normally the most it can do is to turn his mind in a new direction and convince him of the necessity of working to achieve the permanent change. As for myself, it is necessary to differentiate between what were weaknesses of character and what were mere symptoms of frustration. The latter disappeared naturally with the eradication of their cause, the former had to be fought, and it was a long and arduous fight. And when I say that I never relinquished the quest or turned aside from it, that only means that I never doubted and never ceased to aim at the one goal. It does not mean that no harmful thoughts or wrong actions due to weakness of character ever intervened to create unnecessary difficulties on the path. They did only too often. To be more specific, the desire to be a famous writer, the horror of routine professional existence, the inclination to communism and the longing to go off alone faded out naturally, not being qualities of character but merely symptoms of revolt against the meaningless life which I had hitherto faced. On the other hand, I was a very conceited young man and the quality of conceit, instead of being eradicated, was simply transplanted from my own supposed abilities to the truth of which I was now aware while others were not. Indeed, a certain arrogance which, in Gwenon, might be the impersonal arrogance of truth towards error, was apt to infect even disciples who were less inclined that way by nature than I was. Like so, 36 many new converts, I was agog with enthusiasm to convert others. Basically this was a warm-hearted eagerness to share with them the new wealth I had discovered, but it was tainted also with conceit, with the desire to prevail in argument and prove myself right. It would not be true to say that I proselytized indiscriminately. For instance, I did not try to do so with my colleagues or students at the college where I taught. But whenever I met anyone who seemed able to understand I would try in some way or other to draw him into an argument, quite confident of my superior artillery and skill in using it once the argument started. I also sent Gwenon books to the few friends who I thought would understand. I sent the symbolism of the cross to Morgan. A few months later, when we were in England and I called on him, he simply said that he thought it able but not quite sound. I sent one, I forget which, to Rosamond and she wrote back that it was a nice book. Furious at such faint praise, I wrote her a scathing reply, but it was really I who was at fault. I ought to have sent her a careful and detailed explanation of what it all meant and then followed this up with one of the more elementary books. Perhaps I had the same inability at this time as Martin to give a simple explanation. Truth is simple, only men's minds are complicated and seek complexity. It was through Martin that my wife and I were drawn to Gwenon and thereby indirectly to Bhagavan. Perhaps one cannot know what people will understand or, even if they show initial understanding, pursue the path to a good end. If a man's life really rests on a spiritual basis, some air of serenity and power will radiate from him and draw those who are interested to seek guidance even without argument. That is to say, if it is his nature and destiny to influence people in this particular way, by drawing 37 outsiders into the circle. A master may feel who are his people and draw them to himself, but even that is no guarantee that they will overcome evil. Judas was among the close followers of Christ and Devadatta among those of Buddha. And Muhammad was told, "You cannot save whom you will but whom God wills." It has nothing to do with intellectual ability as commonly understood. A great scientist can fail to understand spiritual science, denying it altogether or having merely the exoteric faith of the simple churchgoer, or getting caught up in some freak occultism. A philosopher can be receptive to the perennial philosophy, reading spiritual texts without grasping their implication. A psychologist can remain ignorant of what underlies the mind. On the other hand, a spiritual master need not be an intellectual. Ramakrishna had the mind rather of a peasant than a philosopher, and Ignatius Loyola was temperamentally so averse to study that it required an immense effort for him to take his degree, and he was middle-aged before he did so. It is also not a question of any special faculty comparable, for instance, to that for art or music. It is not a question of being psychic. There is nothing spiritual in psychic powers or in most that are called occultism and spiritualism, while, on the other hand, people who are not psychic can understand and take the quest. Psychic ability may be a help at certain stages of some types of path, but it is more likely to be a danger, since it can open the mind to various allurements which have to be left behind, like the sirens whom Odysseus heard but against whom he made his crew plug their ears. If the pleasure of the physical world is seductive and hard to renounce, those of the subtle world are certainly no less so. Christ said that if a man attains to the kingdom of heaven, all else shall be given him in addition, but that is after attaining. 38 If he seeks all else beforehand, he is not likely to attain. It is safer to have one's ears plugged. It might be said that what is required is willingness to open one's heart to the truth, in fact to surrender oneself, to give up one's ego, to conceive of the possibility of its non-existence. That is why the Quran speaks of unbelievers rather as perverse than ignorant, saying of them that even if an angel came down from heaven to explain to them, they would not listen. From this it might be supposed that those who do understand and take the quest should be people of uncommon goodness, strikingly free from egoism. Some are, no doubt, and it is they who are on a good way, because, whatever the religion and whatever the path followed, it is a path towards liquidation of the ego, the individual, I, consciousness with all its fears and cravings, its grudges and pettiness, and therefore the goal obviously cannot be attained while building up or even retaining the ego. However, it is by no means always so. In fact, many who take the path, many members of spiritual groups, will be found to be more egoistic than those one would be likely to meet in some group of people united for worldly or social ends, more jealous, more ungoverned, quicker to take offense, less generous, less inclined to give in. This is likely to come as a shock and disillusionment to one joining such a group. One explanation that is given is that spiritual training, as is claimed also for certain types of psychiatric treatment, squeezes out the lower tendencies in a man, of which he himself was perhaps unaware, bringing them to the surface and thereby making them temporarily more obtrusive, so that an aggravation is a stage in the cure. When a devotee complained to the Maharshi that other thoughts arose more forcibly when he tried to meditate, he replied, "Yes, all kinds of thoughts arise in meditation. That is only right." 39 For what is hidden in you is brought out. Unless it rises up, how can it be destroyed? Thoughts rise up spontaneously, but only to be extinguished in due course, thus strengthening the mind. The teachings of Ramana Maharshi in his own words, ch. 5. Once when people complained to him of the arrogant behavior of an old devotee, he replied, "That is his vasanas, inherent tendencies, coming out." When a person first understands and sets forth on the spiritual quest, one may see a new radiance overspread him, a sort of foreshadowing of his perfected state, making him altogether delightful. However, this will not last. It will be followed by a stage when all his lowest possibilities come to the surface and he seems to be worse than before. At this time patience is needed. However, this stage is also temporary, and therefore this cannot be the full explanation of the egoistic types that are often found in a spiritual circle, at any rate such of them as were arch-egoists before taking the path and remained so afterwards. When Christ was accused of associating with riff-raff, his reply was that it is those who are sick that need a doctor, not those who are well. There was probably a good deal of sarcasm in this reply, for Christ also was an extremely militant teacher and verbally he hit back hard when attacked. It can hardly be taken at its face value, because only those who have attained the goal are really well, certainly not the smugly self-satisfied who could ask such a question. However, it does indicate that it is often the misfits, those who have failed to adapt themselves to life, who recognize that they are sick and seek treatment. When the Maharshi was asked why we should seek self-realization, he would sometimes answer, "Who asks you if you are satisfied with life as it is?" When asked what use it is, he replied, "Why do you seek self-realization? Why don't you rest content with your present 40 state? It is evident that you are discontented, and your discontent will come to an end if you realize yourself." Ibid. ch. 7. This explains why it is the discontented who seek, but not why so many of them are unpleasant persons. It may be because the quest offers much for the ego to grasp at. This may seem a surprising statement when its whole purpose is the liquidation of the ego, and yet it is true. Man in his present state possesses only a small part of his potential powers and perceptions. The process which goes on, often unconsciously, during the quest is a twofold process of expansion and contraction, symbolized by Jupiter and Saturn, expanding a man's faculties while at the same time crushing him to the point of self-nodding, as the mediaeval Christian mystics put it. Christ said that a man must lose his life in order to gain it, and that when a man attains the kingdom of heaven, all else shall be added to him. This represents two successive stages,